Ah, shit. Okay, I need to say that.
Hi, Papa.
Don't be like that.
Kiki.
Anyway, welcome to Young Gifted and Deaf, the podcast. I'm Sabian Mohammed, your host, and here I'm bringing you a view of life from a deaf perspective. This podcast has been a year in the making. I first had the idea when I was thinking about the deaf community, and to be honest, my initial idea was to create a podcast that had nothing to do with the deaf community. I wanted to create a podcast that focused on the hearing community, attempt to explain to the hearing community the struggle I faced as a deaf man in this hearing-centric world. My hope was that somewhere along the line of the journey of the podcast, I'd be able to connect with the deaf people, get into the deaf community, bang, bang, just a line. But for most of my life, I honestly thought not much of my deaf identity. And that was because I wasn't brought up in the deaf community, and the general approach to my deafness was not to talk about my deafness. And I thought that was for the best, but as I got older, I started to realize that was not the case. So I did my own research, I tried to find answers to questions I didn't think were being asked. The culmination of this is why I can now bring you Young, Gifted and Deaf, the podcast today. But it's weird, right? We always have a plan in our minds, an image of how it's going to look and how you want to get there, how you're going to get there, but it never quite turns out that way, right? My journey and the format of Young, Gifted and Deaf that I'm bringing to you today is actually thanks to the deaf community. The very community I was hoping with my original podcast idea would reach out to. They're the ones who have inspired this new format. And that's because in the early months of this year, it suddenly occurred to me at 31 years old to go onto Twitter, right, and search #deaf. I'm not even into you. And literally from that moment, I've been connected to deaf people all over the world. But that was an amazing moment now I think about it. And looking back, I took the time to observe the deaf community, the conversations and topics that were important to them, the issues that were bothering them, the things that were stopping them from being able to live an independent life. I just feel like there might be a community of people who finally understand me. I'm yet to come across anyone who has gone as long as I will have and didn't feel understood by anyone around them and not know why. The more I observed the deaf community on Twitter, I realized that they didn't have the same attitudes as me, and there was quite a bit of elitism, judgments from people, like myself, who's oral deaf, people who are profoundly deaf but can speak. It's a judgment about how proficient your fellow deaf people are in sign language or gatekeeper behavior. So when I initially had the idea for the podcast a year ago, it just didn't work out like that. But I'm thinking, this is exactly what I was trying to escape from the hearing world. How are the very people who is meant to understand me doing the same thing to the people who are meant to understand me as hearing people? A bit of a tongue twister, but I'm sure you understand. But more importantly, I thought there was a bigger question that needed to be asked. And that bigger question was, why is it that the deaf community and the hearing community don't understand each other? One has a language that it needs to survive as a basic necessity. Have another community, the hearing community, that pacifies that language, you understand? But within that language, which is an expressive, it's a non-verbal language, it is, for all intents, a universal language. There's no understanding, but that lack of understanding, from what I've taken from my own research, severely impedes, it is severely detrimental to deaf people. Their health-wise or mental health, just your standard of living as a deaf person decreases when you live in a world that is hearing-centric. So as I've gone I'm doing my research and I'm trying to set up this podcast. My confidence and self-esteem is going up and down. So I'm like, I can feel like I can speak for deaf people. I've never been in the deaf community, so how am I meant to speak for them? And this amazing thing happened. Right? This was the whole point of what I just shared with you. By the way, so sorry I lost it. This is gonna happen a lot in the podcast. I'm just gonna go off on a tangent. So first episode, I've let you know Sabian goes off on a tangent. Go right. So what happened was it was this one specific person I really loved reading on Twitter. This person was very positive. This person was very much forward thinking. She tended to address the issues that were coming in the deaf community, the elitism, the injustices of the world, not just in the deaf community, but racism, stuff. And I really began to, interact with her more. She became someone that I thought I could interact with, and she turned out that she was also oral deaf. So she could speak, but she can't hear. She wears hearing aids, and she's just learning the sign language, quite new to the sign language. And she was saying that she felt that people were vilifying her because of how she signed and because she wasn't so proficient in sign language. What I really, really took to with her was that she wants something better, something bigger, not trying to think about how she can fit in. She's thinking about how she can grow up into her own identity. She's an influencer on YouTube, and her name is Kirsty Jade. She's on Twitter, Instagram, is that Deaf Girl KJ. She's an amazing device. For me, it's like a trailblazer, and she kind of gave me a bit of an example of what I would like to do, maybe in a different way, but with my podcast, my YouTube page, I'd like to do something similar. But what she did to me was something I didn't expect. I've been speaking about deafness on my Instagram, so this podcast is going to be a bit of a journey for me. And Kirsty put up a YouTube video, and she put up all these deaf influencers that you should follow. At this point, I probably have 1,200 followers. And now with 2,600 followers, I know my numbers, alright. 2,600 followers, I still don't consider myself an influencer, alright. I'm Sabian, deaf, I'm black, I do calisthenics, I do gymnastics. That's who I am. If that influences you, that's your own fault. Alright, cool. Kirsty, put me on this video. And from her video, I got hundreds, 400-500 deaf people just followed me, and in 1 week, we just kept shooting up. Suddenly, I'm immersed in a deaf community, and I'm just like, wow. I'm just like, okay, but I've been creating so much content for the hearing community. My deaf identity basically being invisible to me. So I wasn't considering my deaf identity. So suddenly I was struggling with knowing I had a group of followers who sign, may not be able to hear, and on varying levels. And then I have another group of followers who don't sign. They can hear, they can watch video, they can consume my content however the hell they want. Now, as someone who understands both of these needs, I was suddenly stuck, not knowing what I could do. How was I meant to balance the needs and also the wants of both types of people? I said this to people before, it makes me feel mixed race. My identity, when I think about the fact that I can speak, people will be like, oh, you can speak so well for a deaf man. I don't actually know what that means because, as I said, I hadn't met any other deaf people besides me. So, as far as I'm concerned, I just speak. Trick or the way when I was younger was to not speak about my deafness. So I was raised as someone who was hearing all the time, and because I could speak, it created that perception that I could hear, but I lip read. I lip read. Well, they're cussing me in the background or something like that. I'm reading your lips. I see what you're saying. I may not actually be saying anything to you, but I know what you've been saying about me. Got it? Cool. That's just one of the gifts of being deaf, by the way. It's just about using this podcast as an opportunity to bridge that gap in a lack of in understanding. There's a massive lack in understanding in both the hearing and the deaf community, because even though the deaf community wants to be heard, they're so embittered, they're so hurt, they're so traumatized by what they've experienced trying to fit in to the hearing community, or just try to live as a deaf person in the world as a human being. And then on the it's hard. We're going to speak about this, but trauma hardens people. Suffering hardens people. On one side, you have the deaf people who are hardened by what they've experienced. On the other side, you have the hearing community who have power, but they don't understand how their use of that power impacts the deaf community or the disabled community even. And because of that, the two clash. Community wants to be understood. They don't really want to interact with the hearing community. Hearing community want to understand the deaf community. They don't want to do it on their terms, which is really going to piss off the deaf community. So we have a bit of an issue here. So I would like to be that person in the middle, because I've lived in the hearing community and I'm a deaf man. Also trying to learn sign language, so I've suffered. I don't want to use my suffering and to vilify the hearing community, or use my suffering to push aside the deaf community. It's about trying to learn from each other, learn from my experiences. And I'm going to be using my experiences, but I will be bringing in guests, I will be bringing in people who can help me to explore some topics around deafness, music, dance, films, and I'll be using anime, all different types of media to try and create an understanding of the world that a deaf person lives in when they live in that hearing environment. At the same time, I also want to challenge the deaf community. I want to challenge the deaf community to raise their standards. I want to challenge the community to break that limitation that I've seen, that I've observed. There is still a limit, even though you are worth more. You know that you can be doing more, and I want to show you how. I want to show you and give you the tools to be able to inspire that level of thinking. But the first thing we have to be asking is why. I find it's got lockdown, you've got Brexit. Man, I don't even want to list. Just trying to think about it is just making my head explode. Everything is up in the world. I would call it chaos. And I'm someone who subscribed to the chaos theory. Chaos theory basically dictates that within chaos, there are patterns that can be found. Within those patterns, you can find a new order. Alright? But you have to first navigate the chaos in order to find those patterns. And it's within this chaos that we can find the patterns that connect the hearing community to the deaf community. There are patterns there, and I would like to help people and bring people onto the podcast who can show the people these patterns, and it's from both the hearing community and the deaf community. This podcast, Young, Gifted and Deaf, I call it Young, Gifted and Deaf because one, I'm not particularly young. Most of the followers who are following, most of my deaf followers who are following me are young. This is for you. This is not for me. This is for you. Because I know that you are coming to a time where you may experience similar to me. You may have questions that are similar to me. And I'd like to be able to help. Not provide answers, but provide you the tools to find your own answers in the least traumatic way possible. And I've got stories that I will show you how I got my answers. I would like others to maybe avoid that, because some of the things I went through was unnecessary, some things were necessary. And it's about being able to balance our experiences. When you balance your experiences, you begin to find out who you are as a human being. So that is the end of Younger and Deaf episode 1 podcast. Next week I'm going to be exploring music, getting on a friend of mine. Guys, please subscribe, comment. If you want to catch me on Instagram, it's right there. If you want to message me, let me know what topics you wanted me to talk about. If you have any questions, if you have any problems, and if you're facing, you would like me to put them to my followers, or would like me to answer shout me a message, send me a message, or shout me. Actually, no, don't shout me, I'm deaf. No. Yeah, there's going to be a lot of that. Anyway, guys, thank you for tuning in. This has been Young, Gifted, and Deaf. You know it.